It started with a single crack in my fence, a crack I didn't put there. By the time I stepped outside, half of it was torn down, leaning like someone had ripped it apart in a hurry. The HOA swore they had urgent reasons, but they wouldn't tell me what those reasons were. They just left the mess and a warning taped to my door. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was the opening shot of something much bigger. Before everything unraveled, life in the neighborhood felt almost predictable. Not perfect, not dramatic, just steady in the way most people hope their home life will be. The kind of place where you wave at the same dog walkers every morning, where the lawns always look a little too manicured, and where the silence at night feels almost manufactured. For years, that predictability was enough for me. My house sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, with a small stretch of trees behind it that made the afternoons feel cooler than the rest of the street. I had spent years slowly improving the place, repainting the porch, fixing the garden beds, replacing the old fence that had come with the property. I wasn't the type to stir up trouble, and I definitely wasn't the type to pick fights with a homeowners association. In fact, for most of my time living there, I could have gone weeks without thinking about the HOA at all. Their letters came, I skimmed the headings, paid the dues, and went back to my life. But things have a way of shifting quietly before they collapse loudly. The first sign was subtle, so subtle that I brushed it off completely. A new face on the board, a name I didn't recognize. The neighborhood newsletter mentioned updated compliance standards and a renewed focus on uniformity. But these phrases had shown up before. They usually meant nothing more than a reminder not to store trash bins in front of the garage, or an announcement about community pool hours. Normal stuff. The kind of rules you expect when you sign the dotted line. Still, there was a new energy in the air. A kind of watchfulness. It began on slow mornings when I'd be working in my backyard. I'd feel the faint sensation of being observed, just enough to make me glance toward the street. A car would be idling a little too long, or a clipboard would flash at the corner of my vision before someone walked away. It was never overt, never direct, always just enough to dismiss as coincidence. I should have trusted my instincts. The community itself was a strange mix of charm and control. The lawns looked like magazine covers, but you always knew they came with a price. Everything was regulated. Grass height, paint color, mailbox placement, fence materials, even the types of flowers you could plant in your front yard. It was the kind of place that marketed peace of mind, but secretly fed on conformity. For a long time, I lived with it just fine. I followed the rules, kept to myself, and stayed out of neighborhood politics. I wasn't looking for conflict. I had work, hobbies, friends, outside the community, a full life that didn't require getting tangled in committee meetings or enforcement debates. But every tightly controlled system eventually tests the wrong person. My fence became the first point of interest. Not because it was out of compliance. Far from it. It was sturdy, freshly stained, and built according to every guideline the HOA provided. It sat exactly where the original fence had been, matching the height, spacing, and style required. In fact, it was probably the most well-maintained structure on my property. Maybe that was the problem, because soon, hints of intrusion began to slip into my daily routine. A notice on my door about visibility concerns with the fence, even though the HOA had approved the design years earlier. A warning about potential encroachment. Despite the property line being professionally surveyed and documented, each message felt more aggressive than the last, as if someone behind the scenes had decided I was an easy target. I still remember standing in my backyard, reading the third notice, feeling my stomach knot in quiet irritation. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just confusion wrapped in the faint sense of being singled out. Something was shifting, and I couldn't understand why. The neighborhood around me looked the same. The same trimmed hedges. The same identical mailboxes. The same families doing their daily routines. But underneath the surface, something was changing. A push, a pressure. A decision made somewhere without my knowledge. What I didn't know then was that my fence was only the beginning. Someone was preparing to drag me into a fight I never asked for. A fight that would expose just how far an HOA could go when one board member decided they wanted control. And by the time I realized what they were after, the damage had already begun. I just didn't know how far they would take it, or how far I'd eventually be forced to go in return. The pressure began building slowly. Like a pot left on a burner no one remembered turning on, and before I realized what was happening, the heat from the HOA had crept into every part of my daily life. It started with the fence notices, but those were only the opening act. Within a week, the letters shifted from warnings to violations. Even though nothing about my property had changed since the day the fence was installed, the accusations became vague and cryptic. Phrases like non-compliant structural features and unauthorized modifications that made no sense given the board's previous approval. Every time I tried to get answers, the HOA office brushed me off with generic lines about ongoing investigations. That was when the fines began. They arrived in crisp envelopes, each one stamped in bold red lettering, each one demanding payment for infractions that didn't exist. The first fine accused me of blocking a community sightline, whatever that meant. The second claimed the fence created potential safety hazards. The third scolded me for failure to cooperate, even though no one would tell me what they wanted me to cooperate with. Soon the fines added up to more than my monthly mortgage payment, and the pace of them only increased. Some days I'd wake up to 2 or 3 new notices taped to my door or shoved into my mailbox. I tried to stay calm at first, telling myself there had to be a misunderstanding, a mix-up, a glitch in paperwork. But the truth became impossible to ignore when I discovered the new board member, Carl, was behind all of it. He had been elected only weeks earlier, and from what other residents whispered, he was the type who loved rules more than people, the kind of man who treated guidelines as weapons and believed authority was meant to be exercised, not questioned. The fact that he'd taken an interest in my property was no coincidence. He had a reputation for picking targets. The HOA had become his personal playground, and he had decided my fence was going to be his latest crusade. The harassment escalated in ways that felt almost strategic. My trash pickup was suddenly out of schedule, leaving my bins ignored for days until critters tore them open across the driveway. A landscaping company I had used for years abruptly canceled my service after receiving what they described as a concern letter from the HOA, hinting that working with me could violate community guidelines. Notices began appearing on the side of my house at odd hours. Early mornings, late nights, suggesting someone was intentionally coming onto my property when they thought I wouldn't notice. The final straw came one afternoon when I returned home and found a printed packet on my porch titled Mandatory Compliance Review. Inside was a detailed list of demands. Repaint the fence, replace the gate hinges, trim back trees that weren't even on my side of the property line, and submit updated documentation to prove the fence wasn't installed improperly. The kicker: they gave me 3 days to complete everything. 3 days. For work that would have taken a full crew a week. For requirements that weren't even legitimate in the first place. It was a trap. And they knew it. I felt the frustration boiling beneath my ribs, the helplessness tightening in my throat. The more ridiculous the demands became, the more obvious it was that they were trying to force me into non-compliance so they could hit me with even larger fines or, worse, liens. That evening, as I sat on my back porch staring at the fence that had become the symbol of this unwanted war, I heard rustling on the other side. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Then whispers. When I peered through a small gap between the planks, I glimpsed 2 board members standing with clipboards, pointing and gesturing as if mapping out more violations. They didn't see me, but I saw them, and that was when I realized this wasn't about rules at all. This was personal. Or at least, it was personal for them. And if I didn't find out what they were planning, I was going to be steamrolled before I even understood the rules of the game. The next morning, I tried something different. I went to the HOA office in person. The receptionist barely looked up, acting as if I were interrupting something important. When I asked to speak with Carl, she claimed he wasn't available, though I could clearly see him through the office window laughing with another board member. When I insisted, she dropped her polite mask and said he wasn't taking unscheduled confrontations. That was the language they used now. Legal sounding, accusatory, intentionally intimidating. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I demanded access to my compliance file, something I knew homeowners had the right to view. After several tense minutes, she returned with a thin folder. And as soon as I opened it, my stomach sank. Inside were photos of my property I'd never seen, taken from angles that could only come from stepping onto my backyard. Taken at night. Taken while I slept. The invasive feeling hit me like a punch. They weren't just monitoring my property. They were entering it. They were watching me. Documenting me. Building a case based on fabricated evidence and manipulated images. One photo showed a cracked board on the fence that didn't exist. Another showed overgrown brush that wasn't mine. It was a manufactured reality designed to justify the punishment they had already decided I deserved. And at the bottom of the file was a note in Carl's handwriting. If pressure continues, proceed with structural correction. I didn't know what structural correction meant at the time, but a chill spread through my chest. Whatever it wasn't going to be good. Over the next week, every moment felt like a test. I tried documenting everything, taking photos, recording dates and times, keeping a detailed log. But the HOA seemed to stay one step ahead. The notices became more pointed. The threats of legal action more aggressive. They hinted at property seizure, at forced repairs, at special assessments for community impact caused by my obstruction. The anxiety became constant, a shadow following me everywhere. Even sleep felt unsafe, like at any moment I'd wake up to someone on the other side of the fence with another clipboard. Then came the day everything snapped. I arrived home to find 3 men in orange vests ripping down a section of my fence. They had already removed several boards, leaving an open gap into my backyard. When I demanded to know what they were doing, they handed me a printed order from the HOA stating that the non-compliant fencing was being corrected for community safety. My voice trembled with rage as I told them the fence was approved, documented, surveyed, and perfectly within guidelines. But they shrugged, saying they had authorization. As splinters fell and wood cracked under their crowbars, something inside me shifted. The helplessness evaporated, replaced by a cold, focused determination I hadn't felt in weeks. That was the moment the rising action truly peaked. When the HOA crossed from harassment into destruction. And as I stood there watching pieces of my property being hauled away like trash, one thought repeated in my mind with a clarity that cut through all the noise. If they wanted a fight, they had just given me the ammunition to destroy them. What I did next would push this conflict far beyond notices, fines, or threats. Because they had annihilated the one thing they thought would break me, and in doing so, they revealed exactly where they were weakest. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the HOA's precious community pool was about to become their biggest regret. The moment everything tipped, truly irreversibly tipped, came only a few days after the demolition of my fence. It was surreal how quickly the HOA escalated once they sensed blood in the water. The gap they'd carved into my yard became their justification for even more compliance checks, each one more invasive than the last. They walked freely across my grass, took photos of areas that had nothing to do with their fabricated violations, and even marked parts of my lawn with spray paint, like they were planning some kind of excavation. The sense of violation grew heavier with every passing hour. And worse, the notices they left behind suggested the HOA now considered themselves entitled to continue structural alterations as deemed necessary. That single sentence became the lightning bolt that electrified my anger into something far sharper. A clarity that told me they were daring me to fight back. They believed I wouldn't. They believed no homeowner ever would. It all came to a head at the emergency community safety meeting they called. A meeting that was never on any schedule, never announced through the usual channels, and suspiciously took place only after my fence had been destroyed. Word spread quickly that attendance was strongly encouraged, which in HOA language meant failing to show up could become its own violation. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Residents gathered in uncertain clusters, whispering, frowning, trying to interpret the cryptic notices they'd received. Everyone sensed something was off, but no one knew what the board had planned. Then I saw it, a large poster board, displayed at the front of the room, propped on an easel like an exhibit in a courtroom. On it was a blown-up photograph of my yard. The gap in the fence was front and center, circled dramatically in red ink. Beneath it, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Angio ing Safat Theat." The room fell into an uneasy hush. Carl stood beside the poster, adjusting his tie with smug precision, relishing the attention. The rest of the board lined up behind him like soldiers ready to dispose of the dissenter. As the crowd settled, he tapped the microphone and launched into his speech, with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. He spoke of chronic violations, refusal to cooperate, community risk, and structural instability. He spoke like a man reading from a script he'd written for himself weeks earlier, long before he ordered workers to rip open my fence. Every phrase was designed to paint me as the villain of the neighborhood. A danger. A nuisance. A threat to the harmony of their meticulously manicured world. I felt eyes shifting toward me, some filled with confusion, others with the kind of judgment that spreads easily in communities where appearances matter more than truth. But what chilled me most wasn't the accusations. It was how confidently Carl delivered them. He believed no one would question him. He believed every word he said would be accepted as fact. Then he crossed a line I didn't expect. He claimed I had refused multiple mandates to correct hazardous fencing conditions. He claimed the damage to my yard was self-inflicted, an attempt to create sympathy or disrupt the uniformity of property lines. He even went so far as to claim I had tampered with community assets, hinting that I'd tried to manipulate HOA property markers. The lies were staggering, bold, brazen, and the final blow came when he revealed a motion the board planned to vote on that night, whether to impose a special assessment against me that would allow the HOA to restore compliance at my expense, a cost he projected to exceed tens of thousands of dollars, enough to ruin someone financially, enough to force someone out. It was the moment the truth became undeniable. This wasn't about a fence. It never had been. This was a power play, one intended to make an example out of me, so Carl could tighten his grip on the entire community. A low murmur rippled across the room. Residents looked uneasy, some clearly skeptical, but too intimidated to voice it. Others simply seemed overwhelmed by the drama, unwilling to take a side. That's exactly why HOAs like this thrive. Silence is the strongest weapon they have. And that's when I stood up. Every heartbeat felt like thunder as I walked toward the front of the room. I didn't yell. I didn't snap. I didn't match Carl's theatrics. I simply placed a single folder on the table, beside his stack of fabricated documents. My folder. The one I had spent days building. The one filled with timestamps, photos, recordings, and most importantly, copies of the original fence approval signed by the previous board. The moment I lifted the first page and held it toward the room, the tone shifted. I explained, clearly and calmly, that the board had approved every inch of my fence years earlier. I showed the signed documents. I displayed high-resolution, time-stamped photos proving the fence was in perfect condition before the unauthorized demolition. I revealed the nighttime photos that had been taken without my consent, pointing out angles that proved someone had trespassed onto my property. I detailed every fine, every false claim, every demand made without proper notice or due process. And then I played the recording. The one capturing the contractors saying they had been ordered to tear down my fence without notifying me first. The one where a board member, whose voice was unmistakable, said, "We'll call it safety compliance. It doesn't matter if it's true." The room erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Residents turned to each other in disbelief, shaking their heads, whispering angrily. The facade of control Carl had built began to crumble. He stepped forward, red-faced, sputtering excuses, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that the documents weren't current, that I was misrepresenting facts. But every desperate attempt he made only dug the hole deeper. Because I wasn't finished, I pulled out one more piece of evidence. A printed email chain from a former board member who had quietly reached out to me after hearing rumors of what Carl was doing. The emails revealed that Carl had pushed aggressively to rewrite compliance standards after taking office, targeting properties he believed were overly modified or visually disruptive. And at the top of that list, highlighted in yellow, was my address. The room erupted again, louder this time. Residents shouted questions at the board, demanding explanations, demanding accountability. Some stood from their chairs and declared they had experienced similar harassment. Others accused the board of abusing power for personal satisfaction. Carl looked cornered, his confidence stripped bare. And still, he tried to salvage his sinking authority. He slammed his hand on the podium, raising his voice, calling me defiant, noncompliant, a threat to governance. He even attempted to adjourn the meeting, early to avoid further scrutiny. But for the first time, the other board members didn't fall in line. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing they could no longer hide behind Carl's bravado. One board member quietly stepped away from the table. Another refused to vote, and a third said, in a shaky voice, that perhaps the matter required further review. The tide had fully turned, but the most powerful moment came when a resident stood up. An elderly woman who rarely attended meetings, and said she had lived in the community for 20 years. She said she had never seen anything like what Carl had done to me. And then she said what everyone was thinking. This isn't leadership. This is bullying. The room applauded. The motion against me collapsed on the spot. The board announced they would freeze all enforcement actions pending an investigation, one that the residents now demanded be conducted by an independent mediator. The meeting devolved into chaos, but for the first time, it was chaos working against the HOA, not in service of it. As the crowd dispersed and the board retreated into a back room, I walked outside into the cool night air, my hands still shaking from adrenaline. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But the turning point had finally, definitively arrived. The lies had been exposed. The power Carl wielded so arrogantly now hung by a thread, and as I stood on the clubhouse steps, one thought echoed with absolute certainty. The HOA had unleashed a war they thought I would lose. They had no idea what was coming next. The fallout from the chaotic community meeting didn't happen overnight. In fact, the days immediately after were strangely quiet, almost unnervingly so. The HOA that once flooded my mailbox with threats and warnings suddenly went silent. No new notices, no fines, no urgent inspections creeping onto my lawn. It was as if the entire machine had stalled, its gears jammed by the truth finally shoved into the light. But beneath that surface calm, something much larger was shifting. Neighbors who'd never spoken more than a passing hello suddenly began stopping by. Some offered apologies, not for anything they had personally done, but for not realizing how deep the HOA's behavior had gone. Others shared their own stories, small violations blown out of proportion, vague threats, unexplained fees that never made sense, intimidation that had quietly suffocated the community for years. What I'd endured wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern, one nobody had dared challenge until now. And that was the first ripple of impact. People started speaking up. Residents formed small groups to discuss their experiences, comparing notes, piecing together a timeline of board overreach that stretched much farther back than I could have imagined. They discovered discrepancies in financial reports, inconsistencies in enforcement logs, and surveillance, like behavior aimed at multiple households. The more people looked, the more the cracks in the HOA's foundation widened. Within a week, a petition began circulating to demand a formal audit of the board's conduct. An audit conducted by an independent management company, not one conveniently connected to the HOA's current leadership. The petition filled up faster than anyone anticipated. When it reached the required number of signatures, the board had no choice but to schedule a special vote. And that was the moment the real unraveling began. Carl tried to control the narrative, of course. He sent out long-winded emails describing the petition as misinformed hysteria and an attempt to destabilize community order. He accused residents of being manipulated by unvetted sources and insisted the board had acted within its full authority at all times. But by then, his words didn't carry the same weight. The bravado he once wielded effortlessly now rang hollow. The night of the special vote, the clubhouse was packed. Not just filled, overflowing, Residents lined the walls, the doorway, the path outside. So many people attended that chairs had to be brought in from the pool area. The murmurs of anger, frustration, and disillusionment created a buzz so loud it felt like electricity in the air. The board sat at the front, stiff and uncomfortable, each one avoiding eye contact with the crowd. And there, in the center of them, was Carl. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, his confidence fractured. The same man who once strutted through the neighborhood like he owned it now looked like a cornered animal waiting for an escape route that didn't exist. The independent mediator, hired because residents demanded it, took the podium and began reading the results of the preliminary audit. Every line felt like another brick being knocked out of the HOA's structure. Unapproved fines, misallocated funds, unauthorized property access, selective enforcement targeting specific residents, records revised after the fact, multiple instances of board votes that never actually occurred. Each revelation hit the room with the force of a gavel, and when the mediator reached the section detailing the demolition of my fence, done without any inspection report, safety citation, or homeowner notification, the audience erupted in outrage. Not polite disagreement, outrage. People stood, people shouted. People demanded resignations then and there. And still, the mediator wasn't done. Because at the very end of the review, in cool, clinical language, the audit concluded that the board had overstepped its authority in multiple areas, engaged in inconsistent enforcement practices, and created a pattern of coercive behavior contrary to the governing principles of the community. It was a death sentence for the old regime. When the time came for the community to vote on removing the board, hands shot into the air like a tidal wave. Even those who had stayed silent for years now raised their voices, not cautiously, not hesitantly, but with the conviction of people who finally understood how much they had suffered under an unchecked authority. When the mediator tallied the count, the verdict was decisive. The board was dissolved. All of them. Effective immediately. The room erupted. Some people cheered. Some cried. Some simply sat in stunned disbelief at what they had finally accomplished. The power that had hovered over the neighborhood like a storm cloud for so long had been swept away in a single night. Carl, however, refused to go quietly. He stood, pounding the table, shouting that the vote was invalid, that the audit was biased, that he would challenge everything in court. But no one listened. Even the remaining board members backed away from him, unwilling to be associated with the wreckage he had created. The mediator calmly informed him that he was no longer recognized in any leadership capacity, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw something in Carl's eyes that almost didn't look real. Fear. Not physical fear or even fear of consequences. It was the fear of losing control. The fear of being exposed as a man who built his identity on enforcing rules he believed didn't apply to himself. When he stormed out of the clubhouse, to a chorus of angry voices, demanding accountability, it felt like a weight had lifted from the entire building. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter. Over the next few weeks, a transitional committee was formed, composed entirely of residents chosen by the community, not handpicked by outgoing leadership. They worked with a property management company to rebuild the HOA from the ground up, reviewing every rule, every financial report, every enforcement record. For the first time in years, transparency wasn't a buzzword. It was a priority. And as for my fence, the committee unanimously voted to pay for its full reconstruction using HOA funds. This time with a written apology, notarized and signed by every transitional member. They hired the best contractor in the county, restored the fence better than it had ever been, and installed it under documented supervision so that no one could claim interference again. But that wasn't the end of the consequences. The audit findings were so severe that they were forwarded to the appropriate regulatory agencies. While HOAs aren't governed by traditional law enforcement, they are held to legal standards for financial management and adherence to governing documents. Several former board members faced investigations, quiet, discreet, but very real. As for Carl, he didn't just lose his position. He lost the armor of authority that once shielded him from accountability. Neighbors who once tolerated him now avoided him. Contractors refused to work with him. His attempts to stir up resistance fell flat, and within months, rumors spread that he was preparing to move out of the neighborhood altogether. Whether he left by choice or by pressure, no one knew for sure. But eventually, his house went on the market, and a moving truck appeared in his driveway early one morning without fanfare or farewell. He slipped out the same way he had arrived, quietly, coldly, and without looking back. Life in the community didn't transform overnight, but slowly, noticeably, it began to breathe again. Residents felt free to plant what they wanted in their yards, to decorate their porches without fear of retaliation, to exist without the constant hum of paranoia. The HOA began operating like it should have all along, with fairness, clarity, and neighborly respect. But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't structural or financial. It was cultural. People started talking to one another more. They shared concerns without fear. They bonded over the ordeal, realizing that isolation was what had allowed the previous board to gain power. They understood now that silence wasn't neutrality. It was surrender. As for me, the experience changed something deeper. I had always been someone who tried to stay out of conflict, someone who valued peace over confrontation. But this fight taught me that sometimes peace requires standing your ground. Sometimes fairness requires speaking up, and sometimes the only way to stop abuse is to become the voice that exposes it. In the end, my fence wasn't just rebuilt. My entire sense of agency was too. I didn't join the new board, though some residents urged me to. Instead, I chose something quieter, but equally important. I joined the Compliance Review Committee, not to enforce rules, but to make sure they were never abused again. And every time I walk past the community pool, the very place where so many HOA decisions had been made behind closed doors, I feel a strange sense of closure, because the pool once symbolized the board's authority. Now, it symbolizes the moment that authority finally collapsed. And as for the community's future, well, that's up to all of us. But one thing is certain: power only grows in silence. And this neighborhood has finally learned how to speak. So, I'll leave you with this. Something worth thinking about long after the story ends. If an HOA could cause this much damage in the shadows, what could your community uncover if you start turning on the lights?